We all know grief is tough, right? Like it's something most of us kind of expect to go through at some point. But what about when the loss itself doesn't really make sense? Like you're stuck with more questions than answers, and that whole what if thing just won't go away.
Yeah, it's a different kind of beast.
That's exactly where we're going today. We're diving into ambiguous loss. And just to be clear, we're not just talking about death here. We're talking about those situations where the loss is unclear, it's unresolved. Think like a missing person, Or maybe a diagnosis like dementia. Even the fallout from something like a romance scam, it can really mess you up.
Absolutely. And to help us really unpack this, we've got an expert joining us today.
I'm so glad you could be here.
Glad to be here. It's great to be talking about this.
Yeah.
You're spot on. Ambiguous loss, it's a strange thing. The SCARS Institute, they do a lot of work with scam and fraud victims. They've got a good way of putting it. They say it's that struggle to find closure, to really understand what happened.
Because without that closure, it's like you can't even begin to grieve, right?
It really throws a wrench in the whole grieving process. You get stuck in this cycle, constantly searching for answers that might not even be there.
So it's not that straightforward thing like denial, anger, acceptance. We hear about that a lot.
Not quite. It's much more about learning to live with the open ends, the unanswered questions, and finding ways to heal, even when you're surrounded by that uncertainty, which, let's be real, it's really hard.
It sounds incredibly tough, and the examples that SCARS gives, they really paint a picture. They talk about two main types of ambiguous loss, physical and psychological. So with the physical kind, we're thinking about situations like missing persons, where someone vanishes, their loved ones are just left in limbo, they're clinging to hope, but also they're dreading the worst possible outcome. Or even cases where after a war or some kind of disaster, families, they never recover the body of someone they've lost.
And it's that lack of physical confirmation that makes it so difficult, that what if that just hangs in the air. It makes it so hard to really accept the loss and find some peace.
It's just heartbreaking.
It really is. Think about, for instance, families of those who disappeared in the Holocaust. Generations later, they're still dealing with that unresolved trauma, that lack of closure. And it can have a really profound and lasting impact. It can almost be like a form of PTSD in a way.
Right. And then you have psychological ambiguous loss, where the person is physically there, but mentally they're absent.
Exactly. And that can be really hard to grasp.
It's like with dementia, Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injuries, all those things, it creates this agonizing distance within a family.
Because the person you love, they're right there, but they don't know you. They're not who they used to be. It makes you question your whole relationship with them, your role in their life.
And it's such a mind-bending thing to try to wrap your head around.
It really is. If your own parent doesn't remember you, does that change the fact that you're their child? These are such tough questions, and there aren't any easy answers.
And then, to make things even more complex, sometimes you see this awful blend of both physical and psychological ambiguous loss.
It could be a double whammy.
Romance scams are a perfect example of that. You think you found a connection, maybe even love, only to realize it was all a lie, completely fabricated. The person you thought you knew, they might not have even existed, at least not in the way that you believed they did.
You're mourning a relationship, but at the same time, you're dealing with the fact that your entire reality has been shattered. It's like you've built this whole life, this whole understanding of the world on a foundation that suddenly crumbles beneath you.
It makes you question everything.
It really does.
So how do you even start to cope with that, with this different kind of grief? Like we hear about the stages of grief, but it seems like ambiguous loss throws all of that out the window.
Yeah, it's not so straightforward. And that's why I think it's so important to focus on resilience more than finding closure. Because sometimes those concrete answers, they're just not there. It's more about learning to live with the what-ifs, and finding ways to heal within that uncertainty.
Which I imagine takes a whole different kind of strength. It's like you're accepting the loss without having all the pieces.
Exactly. And that's why getting support is so important. SCARS, they talk about trauma-informed therapy, and it makes so much sense when you think about it. Ambiguous loss, it is a kind of trauma.
Absolutely. It really messes with your sense of reality because it's not just about losing someone or something. It's about losing your whole understanding of the situation, maybe even your understanding of yourself.
Right. And having a therapist who gets that, who can help you work through those really complicated emotions, it can make a world of difference. They can give you the tools to cope.
They can help you navigate that. And speaking of navigating those emotions, I remember reading in the SCARS document about different types of grief that are all tangled up with ambiguous loss. There's anticipatory grief, disenfranchised grief and frozen grief.
Oh, yeah, good ones to talk about. Anticipatory grief, that's that feeling of grieving before the loss is even complete. It's like you're already mourning what you know is slipping away, even though it hasn't fully disappeared yet.
Like if someone you love has Alzheimer's, you're grieving the person they were, the relationship you had, even while they're still physically there.
That's a great example. Or even with those romance scams we were talking about. Victims, they can feel anticipatory grief when they realize that the person they thought they knew, they never really existed. That moment, even before the relationship is over, can be incredibly painful.
It's like the ground starts to give way beneath you before the earthquake even hits.
That's a good way to put it.
And then you have disenfranchised grief, which is that feeling that your grief isn't really valid, like other people don't get it or don't think it's a big deal.
Exactly. It's the kind of grief that gets dismissed because society doesn't have a neat little box for it.
Right.
Think about losing a pet, for instance. People might say, oh, it's just a dog, or you can always get another one. They don't understand the depth of that bond and how real the grief is.
Or even with romance scams, someone might say, well, at least you never actually met them in person, as if that makes it hurt less.
Exactly. It's like they think the fact that it was online makes it less real.
Yeah.
But it doesn't change the emotional connection that was there, even if it was built on a lie.
It doesn't.
And that lack of validation, it makes it even tougher to deal with the loss because you're not just grieving, you're also feeling like you have to defend your right to grieve.
Right.
And that brings us to frozen grief, which is a whole other...
Which sounds particularly rough.
It can be. It's almost like being stuck in shock, where you can't fully process what's happened. The ambiguity of the loss, it keeps you frozen. You're just kind of suspended in this in-between place, not sure how to move forward because nothing makes sense.
It's like one of those movies where everything just stops and you're waiting for it to start again, but it never does.
That's a really good way of putting it. And for people who are dealing with frozen grief, being able to kind of nudge things along to start processing everything, that's a huge step.
So for someone listening, maybe they're going through something similar, maybe they're feeling lost in all of this. What can they do? How do they find solid ground when everything feels so uncertain?
It can be so isolating, that feeling of being totally alone with it. But you're not alone. And asking for help, it's not weak or anything. It actually takes a lot of strength. It's like grabbing onto a lifeline when you're caught in a rip current.
And Scars, they really echo that. They talk a lot about the importance of finding a qualified trauma professional.
Because really, at the heart of it, ambiguous loss is trauma. It leaves you feeling like the world doesn't make sense anymore. And a trauma-informed therapist, they can give you the tools to deal with those feelings, to cope in healthy ways, and to start healing, even when things are still so uncertain.
They can help you figure out how to navigate it all.
Exactly. It's not about having all the answers, because sometimes those answers just aren't there. But it's about finding your own inner strength, your own resilience, so you can handle whatever comes your way.
This has been such an eye-opening look at a type of grief that, honestly, doesn't get talked about enough. We've covered so much ground today. We talked about what makes ambiguous loss different, how it impacts us. We looked at all the different ways it can show up, from those awful situations where a loved one goes missing, to those quieter struggles of watching someone you care about deal with something like dementia. But I think the biggest takeaway here, the most important thing we've talked about, is that it's okay to ask for help, especially when you feel like you're losing your footing. It takes real strength to do that. So as we wrap up, here's something to think about. What's one small thing, even a tiny thing, that you can do today to acknowledge any ambiguous loss you might be carrying with you? Maybe it's calling a friend, finding a support group, or even just letting yourself feel those tough emotions without judging yourself for it. Remember, healing, it's a journey. It's not about getting to a certain point. And you don't have to go through it alone.